It's our stories. Welcome to a world where real stories sounds like a movie script.
I never expected a household appliance to rewrite the last 17 years of my life, but that's exactly what happened. My name is Daniel, and this is how the small, ordinary act of changing a fan filter spiraled into a detonating truth. We had built a life that, on the surface, looked steady and comfortable. I met Claire when I was still bent on avoiding marriage, convinced that tying myself down would steal my agency. She was different. Red hair, quick laugh, a kind of ferocious softness that made me forget my vows to remain single. She had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, and I stepped into their lives the way you step into a riptide, swept and sure I could handle the current. Anna was 28, Sophie 23 now, but I remember them as the small raw kids she handed me to love. 17 years passed like a series of seasons. We grew into routines, rituals, 1,000 small mercies and compromises. I worked long shifts in the hospital, specializing in ECMO and cardiac care, work that demanded skill and quiet courage. Claire took steadier ground in a legal consultancy, an office job that eventually allowed her to work from home. We spoke, usually, about the things that mattered. We commiserated on the couch about politics, about ethics, and about the small wounds work inflicted on us. I believed we had heavy connection and an honest sex life. We stayed active, kept ourselves fit, and tried to be partners in the little and the grand. I don't remember the exact moment I learned how fragile that illusion was. I remember details, the hum of the overhead lamp, the soft rustle of sheets, the pattern unlock icon on Claire's phone when she handed it to me. We had a Dyson fan in our bedroom. It was a Christmas gift from my brother-in-law, Paul. The app pinged often to remind us to change the filter. My own phone was near the front door. Claire's charger was on the bedside table. I asked to borrow her phone to update the app and reset the filter notification. She slid it across without thinking. The notification popped up while I was fumbling with the Dyson app. At first, I thought it was nothing, just a small blip of modern life. Then a preview line slid across my thumb. I'll bring the special toy. My stomach folded. The words existed, but my brain stalled, like a car that had run out of gas at the bottom of a hill. Claire asked if I was okay. I sat on the bedroom floor and stared at the fan, pretending I had been checking the router settings or the Wi-Fi. I made a stupid remark about IP addresses, because saying anything seemed better than the silence that was swallowing me. I had read anonymous stories online about betrayals and affairs. I had never for a second thought I would be the one to sit on a bedroom floor in that dumbfounded, cold place. But a pattern emerged. Claire had recently activated a pattern lock on her phone. She'd been traveling every quarter for a mandatory meeting, 5 days away, 2 states over. Distance and secrecy, when paired, have a way of becoming corrosive. The next arms of inquiry were practical. I logged into Verizon's messaging portal under her number and my name. There it was, a torrent. Thousands of messages dating back months, flirty memes, suggestive images, then explicit photos anyone would recognize as private. She had gradually shifted from easy, open messages to using more discreet platforms. The man involved, I'll call him Ryan, was younger. He worked in the same field as Claire's consultancy, and he was married with 3 small children. I had met him twice and offered an awkward handshake. He was that stray figure who had become a secret axis in Claire's days. For a while, I wanted the movie version of Justice, a dramatic hotel confrontation in which I humiliated them both on a glittering stage. The lawyer dissuaded me, practical calm counsel that sounded like a cooler version of moral clarity. She told me not to attempt theatrics in a hotel bar. "It will look bad for you," she said. "This is about your future." So I did something less cinematic. I printed the messages, 3 fat folders. Color, $400 and some at a print shop. Chris, who ran the counter, was awkward when the nudes slid through the laminator, but he kept his hands steady and his mouth mostly shut. When Claire returned in the evening, the ritual of ordinary life kept trying to proceed. I asked a few measured questions. She said she was tired. She mentioned the election, and she tried to steer the conversation away from what I was reeling over. I asked about a remote control vibrator I had found in her carry-on, one of those app-enabled toys. She went pale and started to tremble. She tried to explain. Tears came, and they were as useless as apologies can be when stacked against evidence. I felt absurdly like a man cataloging a crime. I told her she had 5 minutes to explain. She couldn't. I logged into the apps I could access, and for the first time, a picture of the other life she had been living became visible. There were messages, scolding flirtations, the repeated confessions of intimacy. She had told the other man things about me in ways that wounded, in peculiar, intimate ways. My insecurities, the things she knew hurt me. She had said, "I love you." That phrase landing elsewhere felt like an instrument. I called Ryan's wife, Jessica, and sent the file. She responded with the stunned politeness of someone who had their private life unearthed in a public way. She told me the truth had been worse than I'd described. Other conversations, other women. He was removed from their home. He lost his job. The shockwaves hit 3 households at once. Days passed as if under siege. I paced through the house I had helped design, trying to measure the new angles of discomfort. I hardly slept. I hardly ate. I drank. Rage and numbness braided together into a strange, mottled thing. My best friend, hardened by divorces, told me to document everything, told me to meet a lawyer, told me to press charges if there was a professional compliance issue. I had already flagged corporate compliance about possible PHI and data breaches because they had been using unapproved channels. That was loathsome and necessary, professional rule breaks layered on top of personal betrayal. I met with an attorney who surprised me by offering blunt compassion. She explained divorce choices, contested or uncontested, mediation versus litigation. She said my job was to tell the whole truth and keep myself from the theatrics that feel so tempting when the heart is a live wire. I signed the petition later that night in a numb haze, an e-signature that felt like the ratification of an ending. At the same time, I printed and compiled more proof at Kinko's and retreated to sleep in 3-hour bursts. The days after the discovery contained episodes I won't be proud of. In a moment of violent contradiction, I summoned sex as if it could be a wound's counter. We had a night that mixed anger with the old patterns of intimacy. I recorded it. I don't show this to absolve myself or to narrate vengeance, only to be honest about the messy, sometimes ugly things people do when their moral compass is shattered. The aftertaste of that night was worse than any drink. It was a mixed thing of shame and an odd relief at exercising raw feeling. I sought therapy, and I was given sedatives to sleep through the intrusive images. I drove 3 hours early one morning with coffee and pastries and sat across from Anna and Sophie in their small condo. They had questions. They had been raised in part by me. The relationship with them was complicated but dear. I told them everything, as plainly as I could. Their faces registered a kind of heartbreaking disappointment. They didn't ask to be in the middle of this. None of them did. We agreed, haltingly, that family can survive fracture, that relationships can be redefined, and that if they needed space, I would understand. In the legal and practical aftermath, Claire lost her job for violating protocols, sending client data via insecure channels and mixing confidences with the wrong medium. Ryan was fired too. I felt an ugly, private satisfaction at the professional consequences. But punishment never fully appeased the place in my chest that had been emptied. People were kind and brutish in turns. Some friends urged me toward public humiliation of Claire. Others said that dignity was the only revenge worth having. I posted carefully and publicly the minimal necessary to inform family and friends who needed to know. I refused to weaponize the story on broad social media. The impulse to declare ruin is strong and cheap, and I wanted to preserve as much of my own dignity as possible. There were absurd private acts, loud record players to make the house less like a chapel of memory, throwing out the dinner she'd asked for in a moment of spite, one of the things I regret, drinking a bottle of scotch my grandfather had bought us when we married. In the middle of that chaos, I also began to perform small acts of repair, running at dawn, packing boxes for a move, filling out job applications for a city that might let me start anew. Seattle seemed possible. I started a journal and wrote long letters to myself I would never send. They were meant to suture small holes. Therapy helped me unpack motives and the psychology of betrayal. My therapist asked me not just what she had done, but why she might have done it. Those were not excuses. They were frameworks that allowed me to look at the architecture of a life rather than only at the collapse. He advised boundary setting, cautioned against confusing punitive sex for reconciliation, and encouraged me to let small mercies accumulate. Days blurred into a rhythm, phone calls with attorneys, doctors, friends, odd kindnesses from neighbors. My parents, blunt and practical, told me some things that hurt and some things that steadied. I told my colleagues at the hospital that I needed a break. I gave notice, not because I hated the job, but because I could not risk being a danger to patients while my interior life felt like a storm. Work had been an anchor for my identity. Offering that up was both terrifying and necessary. We had long conversations, Claire and I, sometimes calm, often jagged. She apologized and tried to explain the allure of adventure and the kind of rush she claimed she'd been chasing. But love, I discovered, is not a license to vanish into secret expeditions. The smallest betrayal is a slow construction. Every unchecked text, every hidden app, every secret laugh adds a brick. I told her I could not accept words as repair without deep, sustained proof. She offered things: open marriage, promises of therapy, pleading pleas. I said no to open marriage. Trust cannot be negotiated into existence. I kept a record of everything. I had to. It felt bureaucratic and bitter, but it helped me feel sane. In the months that followed, my life contracted into essentials: therapy sessions, medical checkups, errands to secure finances, boxes to move. The girls visited and sat on the back steps with coffee. There was laughter that day that did not erase the wound, but it made the world feel less hostile for a while. I am not healed. Recovery is neither tidy nor linear. I have nights when panic and suicidal fantasies circle my mind, and I tell my therapist everything. He listens without judgment and then gives me tasks, small, intentional things, like call a friend, take a shower, list 3 things you can control. Those tiny acts accumulate into territory I can hold. There is grief for the life I thought I would have, the children we didn't have, the degrees I didn't pursue because I chose stability, the mornings that used to begin with coffee and quiet conversation. There's also a strange, small tenderness, a neighbor bringing soup, a friend who sits with me while I sleep, a musician who writes a song that makes me breathe. These minor mercies are the scaffolding of a slow rebuild. I have worked hard to be both honest and merciful with myself. I do not glorify my actions. I own their ugliness. I will not pretend the revenge fantasies I had were noble. Yet I was also trying to survive. The wise among those I listened to, therapists, friends, strangers online who have been through similar ruptures, kept reminding me to focus on survival, not spectacle. Unexpected lessons emerged. I learned that forgiveness is not synonymous with reconciliation. It is, instead, a small, private decision that can free you from being held hostage by pain. I learned that boundaries are not cruelty. They are survival. I learned to let the small routines, cooking a dinner, reading a page of a book, be pleasures rather than punishments. I have started playing guitar again and learning songs slowly, feeling calluses return to my fingertips. Those little acts are anchors. On the practical side, the legal process proceeded. Documents filed, hearings scheduled. We divided assets with the kindness that comes from a mutual desire to avoid further harm. She left the house eventually. I continued to box memories. I moved some things out and kept only what made sense for the next chapter. The hospital accepted my resignation as a fact of life. People crumble. Institutions arranged to keep functioning. I tried to be graceful about leaving the only identity I knew, but it was messy. I have thought a lot about the role of technology in modern infidelity, how apps and small notifications can contain whole narratives we never would have imagined. The fan app was an absurd instrument of revelation, a reminder, a ping, a tiny digital voice saying change filter. There's a macabre irony in being thankful for an alert that wrecked a life. Yet truth, even when brutal, is better than a gilded lie. So I have given the fan a wry nod in my head and moved on. Slowly, life resumed ordinary shapes. I found a few regular things to hold, a morning run that smelled of damp leaves, a certainty that I would eat decently that day, a therapy appointment that would not be canceled. The daughters affirmed they would maintain ties with their grandparents. My friends brought normality into my house again, meals, a quiet couch, quiet presence. I began to make small plans that were not reactive, a concert to attend alone, a trip to a city where no one knew my story, a class to take in the evening. There were, of course, absurdities, people who offered patronizing condolences, acquaintances who delivered tone-deaf platitudes, strangers who thought public shaming would be entertainment. But for every ugly message, there was someone who sat in silence with me and held space without advice. Those people mattered. If the fan had not pinged, I might still be living a curated illusion. The discovery hurt like a physical injury, but it also clarified. Clarity is messy and painful. It is not a tidy gift, but it is something on which to build. I am learning to be a man who does not lean on another person for self-definition. Sometimes that is a lonely project. Sometimes it is a liberating one. The future is uncertain. Whether I will love again, how I will be vulnerable differently, but I am choosing to believe that life contains second acts if we are willing to do the steady work. I keep thinking about the small moments that add up, those tiny, almost invisible commitments that in their accumulation create a life. The way Claire arranged our books by color on the second shelf in the living room, how she would fold my shirts with an absent-minded tenderness, the way she used to hum off-key to old records when she thought I wasn't listening. Once, in the early years, she taught me how to make her mother's lemon pie, an absurd ritual of flour on the counter, 2 hands pressing the crust in together. Those memories are threaded through the grief. I also remember how we navigated our differences. Claire wanted more social steadiness. She loved fundraisers and neighborhood barbecues where she could talk about her projects and count glances like votes of approval. I, on the other hand, was a person comfortable in sterile rooms with monitors and steady hands. It used to feel like we balanced each other. She would say I was too inward, and I'd say she was too public. But we found ways across that divide. I gave up a move to medical school because love and family felt like a different kind of priority then. When everything collapsed, sound took on odd textures. The house had always held a particular acoustic. The soft shuffling of Claire's slippers, the kettle's ascending whistle, the particular resonance when the front door closed. Those sounds had been my punctuation, the auditory grammar of our daily sentences. After the discovery, sound itself felt alien. The little notices my phone made, tiny chirps and beeps I had once tuned out, now felt like taunts. I slept with the bedroom fan's white noise deliberately loud sometimes just to avoid the sharpness of silence. There were legal minutiae that took up a surprising portion of my mental energy. The lawyer advised on property division norms and strategies to protect my stable finances. She made me list the assets, the pensions, the liquid accounts. It all felt coldly administrative, like filling an inventory list after a theft. We talked about the girl's custody of memories and how to involve them. She reminded me that the burden of proof in certain disputes requires evidence, and my printouts were ugly but useful documents. My daughter's faces are a study in contradictions. Hannah, the elder, carries a mien of protective stoicism that I've come to recognize as armor. She asked questions that landed like careful probes about what I remembered and what I forgave. Sophie was more visceral, more immediate. She wept once, then anchored herself in stoic anger in the next breath. We sat on their worn couch, and I waited for an accusation to arrive, for them to choose a side. When they expressed their hurt, it gutted me. They were not just collateral damage. They were people I loved who were trying to process betrayal of their mother and grief for the life they'd known. There were tiny, peculiar acts of defiance that were less about revenge and more about self-definition. I started running again, not to impress an imagined rival, but because the movement helped get my blood right and my head clearer. The tracks early in the morning smelled like wet asphalt and leaf rot. The city felt new in that weather. I wrote long letters to myself, awkward confessions, scratched into a journal, things I couldn't say out loud to others. None of it fit into calm closure. I kept thinking that the only honest thing I could do was face the simplest practicalities with deliberate calm. One evening, I thought about what forgiveness would mean. My therapist pinned it down. Forgiveness is a choice separate from reconciliation. You can forgive, in small, private ways, to cease giving pain power over your days. It doesn't mean you accept the betrayal or pretend it didn't happen. Forgiveness is an internal economy to lighten the weight you carry. For me, that insight brought a brittle, useful hope. I didn't have to reconcile with Claire to choose a future where I am not consumed by her choices. Community stepped in ways I hadn't expected. A neighbor I hardly knew brought over a casserole and an old beaten copy of a novel she'd loved for years. My parents called and gave the kind of blunt comfort only they could provide. Advice wrapped in a family of origin sensibility. My best friend, who had been through multiple divorces, came with unvarnished humor and a steady couch when the nights were too loud. People offered, in their flawed and generous ways, mechanisms for survival. They cooked, they drove me to appointments, they held the space when grief needed to exist. The legal aftermath was practical as well as moral. There were hearings to schedule, documents to file, and decisions about who would keep what. My attorney helped me chart a path that prioritized stability and dignity. When you are processing a personal dissolution, the financial and logistical steps can feel like scaffolding you build around a collapse. They are work that keeps you from tumbling. I took those steps, opening a new account, shifting some investments, booking a moving truck. Each was a small assertion that the future would be ordinarier rather than spectacular. I should admit to being petty sometimes. I posted, in a controlled way, updates to a limited group of friends and family who needed to know. I refused to be theatrical about it on public feeds because I didn't want to be defined by outrage. Anger can be performative. I wanted private repair. A few people urged me to name shame publicly. My hands trembled at the thought. Instead, I chose dignity, disclosure where necessary, silence where appropriate. That didn't stop me from feeling vindictive fantasies, but it kept me from acting on them. Physical intimacy after the betrayal was a maze. There were nights when grief and anger combusted into reckless closeness, and other nights where the slightest touch was intolerable. My therapist warned me that sex with my partner in the shadow of betrayal can be a dangerous mimicry of healing, so I stopped consenting to that as a path to reconciliation. If I found myself in a scene that felt like punishment disguised as passion, I ended it. Boundaries returned slowly like a tide, withdrawing and then returning on a more honest schedule. I did something for myself that felt small and defiant. I bought a cheap journal and wrote a list of things I wanted to do that would have nothing to do with being a spouse. I started learning to play a guitar again, calloused fingertips slow to return but returning, notes stumbling into shape. I read books I'd put off for years about philosophy, about the neuroscience of habit. This work of reconstituting a self is minutiae rich. Appointments, hobbies, dusty seams of curiosity reopened. There were moments when the social world intruded unpleasantly. I received messages from acquaintances, some supportive, some probing. One woman I barely knew messaged to tell me she was sorry for my inconvenience, as if the loss of a husband to betrayal were a minor delay in her shopping list. Some people offered platitudes. Others were crushingly practical. But mostly, the universe telescoped into a narrow set of relationships that mattered. My daughters, my parents, a few old friends, and the professionals who helped me keep from collapsing. Months after the first discovery, the house felt different. It wasn't the absence of Claire. That was still there, in ways I could not yet inventory, but the space was itself altered. The couch sagged in a different pattern. The plants looked thinner. The kitchen's light had changed angle as the season shifted. That was ordinary continuity doing its work. Life goes on, even when you are rebuilding. There came a day when I walked past the fan and didn't look away. I picked it up, looked at the app on my phone, and, for no dramatic reason, registered the next filter change. I thought about the chain of tiny decisions that led me to where I was, the choices to speak or stay silent, to search or ignore. The fan had been a minor actor in a large tragedy. It had been the moment when the thin veil of illusions caught fire. I could choose to curse that small device, but instead I let it be a fulcrum, a reminder that small things can contain big truths. I am learning to inhabit my own company without a partner as an appendage. There is a solemn freedom in that. You are responsible, in the most immediate sense, for your daily rituals. No one else will pack your lunch or remind you about appointments unless you ask. It is both daunting and strangely clarifying. I take comfort in small victories. A well-cooked meal, a morning run that didn't end in collapse, a night where sleep came and I didn't wake with panic. Community, therapy, and time are all cliches because they are true. I do not want to paint recovery as tidy. I still have moments where the memory returns with a sharpness that makes my chest convulse. But I also have times where I sit quietly and feel a small, steady peace. Those incremental wins matter. They are the bricks of a rebuilt life. The girls visited one weekend after the major legal steps were taken. They sat on the back steps with mugs of coffee and shared stories, awkward, tender, fractious, about their lives. We weren't a perfect family that day, but there was laughter and a kind of remembering that was not tied to betrayal. I realized then that familial love can be elastic. It bends and sometimes breaks, but it can reforge itself with care and time. What would I say to my younger self? I would tell him to be braver in asking for what he needs. I would tell him to communicate the desires and the resentments that seem too small to voice. I would not tell him to avoid Claire. She brought joys too, and the story is not only about loss. I would tell them to carry a curious, more rigorous kind of honesty, one that gives permission to both partners to be more fully themselves without resorting to secrecy. If you are reading this and you are raw, you are not alone. You will have bad nights, and some days you will be stunned by how ordinary the world can be. Let the ordinariness in. It will not drown you. It will be mundane and boring, and then, slowly, it will be the foundation of your next life. Read a line of a book each night. Walk in the rain if you feel like it. Call someone who will sit in silence with you. Make a list of 10 things that are yours and not a function of your relationship. I don't know whether I will ever fully return to the man I was before this breach. Maybe that man is gone. Perhaps a future man, wiser, more cautious, but still capable of deep love will emerge. For now, I am a man in process, which sounds pompous and inadequate all at once, but it is true. Sometimes life gives you a terrible clarity. The past is not a monolith, but a collection of moments, and you can rearrange what you can carry. To the fan, again, a begrudging nod. To Claire, I offer a complicated set of feelings that include anger, sorrow, and a trace of gratitude for the honesty that eventually came, however destructively. To anyone who listens, keep your heart. Do your best to be brave, and remember that the most important conversations are the ones you have with yourself. If you want to hear more about the legal process, the therapy, the awkward phone calls with family, the little triumphs of starting over, let me know. I will tell you, because telling is a way to keep from being swallowed by the silence. It strikes me, in quiet moments, how fragile the frame of a life can be and how oddly courageous the ordinary can feel. Making coffee in the morning, folding a shirt, choosing to smile at someone across the street. These are acts of courage when your heart has been bruised. I have begun keeping a small list of things I want to do. One new recipe each week, a concert to attend alone, a place to travel where no one knows my name. These intentions are not extravagant. They are stitches. They are small pledges that life goes on and that I can choose how to live the next stretch of days. People ask if I will ever love again. I don't know. I hope so. Love is a risk, and risk is a part of being fully alive. For now, I choose living, honestly, stubbornly, and with the slow work of repair. If this story reaches anyone who is standing at a similar doorway, knock and ask for help. There are hands that will take it. I close by saying this. Clarity is often accompanied by grief. The two coexist. You can hold both and still move forward. My life is not finished. It is only being rewritten. Minor mercies appear in the strangest places. A neighbor bringing by soup. A song that makes me breathe, a friend's hand on my shoulder. These little gifts are the scaffolding of a new narrative. If you are reading this and are hurting, please tend to the small mercies. They will carry you farther than rage ever could. If you want to talk, to ask questions, or to share your own story, please do. Your voice matters. Thank you for listening to mine. Questions for you. Have you ever had a secret upend your life? How did you find the strength to move forward? What small routines helped you rebuild? Leave a comment. Tell me one thing that gave you hope in a hard time. I am listening. Thank you for staying with me until the end. How would you have acted in the protagonist's place? Write your thoughts in the comments. More fresh and controversial stories every day on my profile. Like and subscribe to this channel.